These are types of events that we've seen our clients, we've seen others that we talk about that do these owned events where you're running the whole event. So you have control over who's on the guest list, who attends, what you talk about, the timing and everything like that. You can put on these events for anywhere from a few $100s to maybe a few $1,000s, and you're getting the perfect people attending because you've perfectly picked who gets the invitations. And the only thing holding you back from doing this more is how good you are at being able to create awareness and drive up the perceived value of attending. So this is for sure a fantastic way to generate leads in a defined geographic area on a low budget. And when you start doing this well, in addition to just hosting this series for your primary buyer persona, you segment it out and create a series for your secondary buyer persona. Maybe you create a version for channel partners that you work with in your local area, where you invite managed service providers, network integrators, value-added resellers, IT consultancies, and do a version of that. And you start to realize once this gets up and running, like, wow, you could literally be doing one of these 30, at least twice a month, maybe 3 times a month. You're like, wow, this is a really, really good low-cost revenue growth engine for our colocation data center business. Now, what about the long-distance prospects and clients? Could you do this with them as well? Absolutely. Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and I am thrilled to welcome you to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If this is the first time you're joining us for our weekly live stream, welcome. If you're a frequent flyer, welcome back. We're thrilled to have you with us. If you're watching live, please let us know in the comments where you're joining us from and what you do in the data center industry or for digital infrastructure or critical facilities. Each week, we tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem, from data center operators like hyperscalers, colocation providers, edge, modular, or wholesale data centers, as well as data center technology companies, data center facilities related companies, construction, real estate investors, as well as the vibrant outsourced sales and marketing company in and around data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Regardless of what your role is, whatever you do on the go-to-market team, perhaps you work in sales like an account executive or a business development or sales development rep. Maybe you're an account manager or a client success, customer success manager. Perhaps you work in marketing or product or channel partnerships, or maybe you're the executive sponsor, the leader that's responsible for getting the right people on the team, sitting in the right seats on the bus, rowing the boat at the right speed, playing the music at the right tempo, the orchestra, the maestro conductor, the aligner in chief. That is all about making sure that your team, your company, is taking its place in this great opportunity that we have in and around data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. So if you want to make sure that you stay up to date on new educational events and resources just like this, make sure that you're subscribed to our data center sales and marketing newsletter. You can do so directly on our website. So those email newsletter updates come to your inbox each Sunday at www.dcsmi.com. So what's on the agenda for this week's show? First up, we're going to look at how a colocation data center business generates leads in a defined geography on a low budget. That's one we hear about a lot. Next, we'll talk about how to create a data center expansion demand response program for modernizing grids for HPC and AI, for high performance computing and artificial intelligence. After that, we'll turn our attention to how a data center energy storage company can connect with data center representatives. After that, we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how modular data center providers can offer budget-friendly solutions for their clients, plus how an IT physical infrastructure company can improve demand generation. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how to address edge data center budget challenges. If you have an idea for a topic, a challenge, a question that you'd like us to consider addressing in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform you like to watch on. So without any further delay, let's jump into this week's first question, which is, how can a colocation data center business generate leads in a defined geography on a low budget? How does a colocation data center generate leads in a defined geography on a low budget? Yeah, that is a fantastic question, because by the nature of how most colocation operators, how most colocation data center businesses look to grow, there are basically two playbooks. There's a playbook that you'll use for creating awareness and educating and building trust and generating opportunities and closing new clients that are in your hyper local area, where someone can get in the car, drive to your location, and be there within maybe 30 to 60 minutes at the absolute most. So there's a playbook for generating leads among that segment. And then there's also a playbook that most colocation operators need for generating leads, nurturing those leads, advancing those leads into opportunities, and closing new business from people that are literally located all over the planet. That's a more virtual, a more digitally focused playbook where it's not easy for them to come and take the tour in your colocation facility. So when we talk about defining the geography on a low budget, first, let's make sure that we're really well, because we need to be really good. We need to be really good at conserving our limited budget. Let's get really tight on who we want to be attracting, who we want to be building this colocation business with. So given that you have an existing business, we're going to first start by looking at where you've been most successful. Where are your happiest clients located? How big or how small are their companies? Are there certain industries? Are there certain verticals? Are there certain niches that have worked out better for you than others? And typically we'll see evidence of this when we look at your website and you talk about where you've been most successful. These could be logos, testimonials, reviews, case studies. At the absolute minimum, for sure, this kind of information is sitting in your customer relationship, your CRM system. It should be pretty apparent when we talk to members of your support team, when we talk to your account managers, when we talk to your account executives. Who are the happiest clients that have been most profitable, most gratifying for your company to work with over an extended period of time? Because as long as your company has product market fit and go to market fit, you likely have been sitting on answers to those questions for years. So let's start by making sure you have a really crisp one-page ideal client profile, ICP defined, that lists out geographically where these clients are located for this defined geography. And remember, for a colocation operator business, even a single location colocation operator business, you're almost certainly going to need a playbook for hyperlocal, and you're going to need a playbook for national or global. And it just gets a little bit more complicated when you introduce a second location or a third location or a handful or two of locations or dozens of locations or hundreds of locations, because each of those physical locations is going to, by definition, need a hyperlocal playbook. And then on top of that, you'll need a more digitally focused, more virtually focused playbook for people that want to co-locate servers, want a whole cabinet, want a whole rack, or multiple cabinets, multiple racks in your facility, but may not necessarily have proximity there. Now, if you have the luxury of having multiple facilities in a single geographic area, you probably have a hyper-local playbook that covers all of those facilities with one go-to-market. If they're further spread out, meaning that people can't get there within a 30 or 60-minute ride, you're going to need a version of this for each of their locations. Now, if you don't have multiple locations, you're also going to put an upper limit on the sophistication level of the kind of clients you can attract, because at this stage of the game, with where we are in the world, there for sure comes a point in time where a certain kind of IT decision maker just simply won't sign on with a co-location operator where they're putting all their eggs in one basket, where it's just one location. They want you to really have that geographic variety, not just for latency reasons, not just for governance reasons, but for disaster recovery reasons. And this is usually what pushes even small, independent, single location, co-location operators to go rent space in someone else's facility in another region, on another part, in another part of the country, in another part of the world. And over time, you start to have locations that you physically own and locations where you also have space so you can deliver on that kind of more sophisticated client that is willing to spend significantly more on co-location services on a monthly, on an annual basis, on a multi-year basis. So we have the ideal client profile, and we're going to need that ideal client profile for both your hyperlocal and your global, your virtual, your digital version. And that may not be quite as global as you think it is also, because when it comes to, for sure, when it's local, the name of the game most of the time is taking that ideal client profile and building out a target account list of anywhere from a couple dozen, usually a few hundred, in some cases a few thousand potential companies in your local area that fit that perfectly, that you'd love to see become clients of your co-location facility. And then from there, you go about building a lead generation program based on educating and building trust with the most important core buyer personas, the most important primary and secondary kinds of decision makers or decision committee members in those companies. And the goal in most cases for that hyper-local playbook, especially for a relatively small colo operator, is to get those folks to come into your facility multiple times, not just for a tour, but to learn with you from your experts within your company. And the reason that's especially important is we now live in a world where, especially among cynical, skeptical IT professionals, they don't want to spend time with your salespeople for very much of the journey anymore. If we were having this conversation 10, 15 years ago, it used to be that you could count on a typical buyer of co-location getting about halfway through their journey, about 56% of the way through the sales process. That was CEB, the corporate executive board at the time, found that 56% of a journey was happening before sales contact. That wasn't too bad because your sales team still was in there for the final 44% of the buyer's journey. Add in 10 years of digital transformation, millions of baby boomers retiring, Gen Z and millennials being in more decision-making roles, tens of millions of people working from home in the beginning of the 2020s, millions of people still continuing to work from home, and that 56% number has jumped all the way to 83%. What does that mean? Gartner has found that 83% of a typical journey is now over before sales contact. 83% of their researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing and decision-making now happens without you being in the room. So even in the best case scenario, you're only in there for the last 17% of the journey. And wow, is that throwing a curveball to a lot of traditional marketers and salespeople who've been working in and around co-location for decades because their prospects are more sales allergic than ever. However, this is the big however, it also opens up an opportunity if you're clever enough to figure out a way to get back in there in that first 83%. How do we get back in there in that first 83% when they're allergic to spending time with sales? We don't show up like sales anymore. We show up as teachers, as consultants, as subject matter experts, as trusted advisors, and maybe even thought leaders. Because these prospects, these future clients, your primary and your secondary buyer persona that fit your ideal client profile, they still want to and need to learn. So professional development is very important to them. When you're able to reboot and reposition your client-facing team members to be seen more like teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, and trusted advisors when it comes to anything and everything having to do with co-location for a specific kind of job function in a specific area, for a typical range of company sizes in certain kinds of industries, it can be game-changing for how your prospects and clients react to your overtures to get them to come in and visit your facility. What does this look like in practice? For most companies, as long as you have a conference room or a classroom or a foyer that can be repurposed into that maybe once a month, You set up a breakfast seminar series, a lunch and learn, a symposia, and you do not need large numbers attending for this to have a massive impact on your lead generation and company growth. Once you've determined, for example, that there's 400 companies on your target account list, and you know exactly who the two different kinds of stakeholders that matter most, and you've really dialed into knowing their goals and challenges, the goal is to take each of their most important goals and challenges and say, for example, you've identified 6 huge goals that the primary buyer persona has when they're looking for colocation, and 6 of their biggest frustrations, 6 of their biggest challenges that they have when they're looking for colocation. Take those 6 goals, take those 6 challenges, you have 12 topics, great. Once a month, you invite those couple hundred people to come into your facility to learn with your internal subject matter experts, or maybe you bring in some of your consultants or channel partners to help with that. And the goal is to provide this amazingly impactful workforce redevelopment, professional development content that's so good, it feels better than any conference that they've attended in recent memory. And let's say this is a breakfast seminar. So maybe you schedule it for 8 to 9:30, where they get there and there's 15, 20 minutes of continental breakfast and networking, and you pull up your slides and your workbook, and your CTO talks to them about what they need to be thinking about, the biggest mistakes that CFOs make or manufacturing companies are dealing with, or whatever it is that show up in your goals and challenges. And that's your core content for the event. Of course, you answer questions, you try to make it as interactive as possible. And then immediately following that, you take them on a tour of your facility. You got plenty of FaceTime with folks from that company and folks from your company. The key is this cannot be seen as a sales trick. This is all about educating and building trust. And the better job you do at educating and building trust, the more likely it is that when you say, hey, we're so glad to see that you're registered for our breakfast seminar next Thursday, our lunch and learn next Thursday, our symposia, our educational event, whatever it is, next Thursday or 3 weeks from Friday, whatever it is. But we know when it comes to picking the right colocation provider, it truly takes a village. There's typically people involved from IT, operations, finance, compliance. So with that in mind, who else from your team should also join us? Who else from your company should also join us? Just simply hit the forward button on your email, tell why this matters, and we'd love to be able to be teaching and helping to align and helping you get multiple stakeholders in your company on the same page about what matters most when it comes to this biggest goal, this biggest challenge that we've identified that folks like yourself are facing. And be shocked the simple email marketing automation that you've been able to do for 10 or 20 years, how well it works. And of course, you know it works because you look down at your event registration confirmations and you start to notice, that's interesting. There's 4 people from the same company out of our 25 registrants. 4 people from the same company, 3 out of 4 of them attend together, and they're learning together. You think that's going to improve your alignment? Heck yeah. You think it's going to dramatically improve your chances of advancing that into a sales opportunity because you're educating and building trust with multiple people on that decision committee? Oh yeah. You think the next time you invite those 3 people, those 4 people, it's likely that even more people from the same company attend, as long as they're getting great value from you? Oh yeah. By default, not only keeps you on the short list, it starts to knock your competitors off of the short list because they're spending so much amazing time learning from you and your client-facing team members that you're starving the oxygen, you're starving the calendar away from them needing to learn from anyone else. This has a game-changing impact on generating early and middle stage and late stage sales opportunities because they no longer see you as a vendor, as a real estate provider, as selling co-working for servers. They see you as the be-all, end-all expert when it comes to IT services, when it comes to colocation, when it comes to telecommunications, when it comes to managed cybersecurity, whatever it is that you're rolling into this for a specific kind of stakeholder in a specific kind of company that's defined by where they're located, roughly what size they are, what industry or niche they are in. So this is how you can do this on a relatively low budget. Does that mean it's zero budget? No, of course not. but compared to going to national or global conferences where you're spending tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars or your local currency equivalent, if you have space in your facility where you can host this kind of event, as long as you have an existing email marketing program, an existing email marketing database where you can email out these invitations, your biggest expense is probably for a breakfast event, bagels, pastries, and coffee. Most of you watching this, I hope, can handle that if you have good enough unit economics on a client value. If you're bringing them in for lunch, deli, a little bit of light catering or something like that. So it's truly a lunch and learn. In the US, maybe you go to Panera or some other deli or Italian, whatever you're going to provide and serve as that lunch and learn for them to enjoy a good meal while they're learning from you and asking questions and getting a great impression of what you're all about. And then, after they've enjoyed that meal, you take them on a quick 15, 20-minute tour of your facility. So you leave them on a high note with all of that. Again, these are types of events that in the US that we've seen our clients, we've seen others that we talk about that do these owned events where you're running the whole event. So you have control over who's on the guest list, who attends, what you talk about, the timing and everything like that. You can put on these events for anywhere from a few $100s to maybe a few $1,000s, and you're getting the perfect people attending because you've perfectly picked who gets the invitations. And the only thing holding you back from doing this more is how good you are at being able to create awareness and drive up the perceived value of attending. So this is for sure a fantastic way to generate leads in a defined geographic area on a low budget. And when you start doing this well, in addition to just hosting this series for your primary buyer persona, you segment it out and create a series for your secondary buyer persona. Maybe you create a version for channel partners that you work with in your local area, where you invite managed service providers, network integrators, value-added resellers, IT consultancies, and do a version of that. And you start to realize once this gets up and running, like, wow, you could literally be doing one of these 30, at least twice a month, maybe 3 times a month. And you're like, wow, this is a really, really good low-cost revenue growth engine for our colocation data center business. Now, what about the long distance prospects and clients? Could you do this with them as well? Absolutely. Except instead of inviting people that are within a 30 to 60-minute ride and calling it a lunch and learn or a breakfast seminar, it's a webinar series where you've identified that there's a certain kind of company and there's certain kind of stakeholders in those companies that are looking for co-location in your region. They're not located in your region. Maybe there's latency reasons or governance reasons why they need to be in your area. Maybe there's fault tolerance, disaster recovery kind of reasons that they need to be in your area. And you've identified that these long distance prospects, these long distance future clients are located in certain regions and certain countries and certain time zones and speak certain languages. And you basically take the same process, building out buyer personas, understanding their goals and challenges. And instead of it being a once a month lunch and learn or once a month breakfast seminar, it's a once a month webinar series. And maybe if you have 2 buyer personas, you do the first week of the month for your primary buyer persona, the 3rd week of the month, or the 2nd week of the month, whatever's comfortable for you, for your secondary buyer persona. And there's a really good chance that you can even use a lot of the same content. In other words, the subject matter experts internally, your consultant subject matter experts, your channel partner subject matter experts that you would pull in locally can also, in nearly all cases, use the same slides, use the same content, use the same expertise, except instead of delivering this to people that are in your classroom, in your conference room, in your foyer, that are physically there proximity-wise, you're there delivering this virtually on Zoom, on On24, on StreamYard, GoToWebinar, whatever you're using to deliver this experience virtually. And of course, both with the local version and the virtual version, record the events, repurpose the events. If there's 20 people that attended, there's probably at least 200, maybe 2,000 people that should have been there. Some of the people that should have been there are the coworkers and colleagues of folks that did attend. And what a great way to drive alignment for them to have a recording, a workbook to be able to pass around to the other people from their team that should have been there that weren't there. And of course, there's some people that may not want to watch the 45-minute version, but would watch a couple of segments that are 3 minutes, 8 minutes, 11 minutes long, or whatever, in medium length videos. And there's some people where you catch their attention by doing vertical videos. We know vertical videos have taken off like wildfire the last couple of years with TikTok and YouTube Shorts, and LinkedIn has their own version of that as well, where instead of getting someone to watch the 45 minutes class or attend the 45-minute webinar or watch the 3-minute or the 7-minute version, you capture them because they watch a 37-second clip that just has them mesmerized to want to watch more. That's on the video side. Of course, you can repurpose this into podcasts. You can repurpose this into ebooks, blog posts, email newsletters, email nurturing, social posts, LinkedIn documents, carousels, all host of this, starting with having fantastic, highly relevant content that delivers great value to your intended buyer personas. So this is how I would approach both the local, the hyper-local, and the long-distance playbook for a colocation data center generating leads in a defined geography on a low budget. Okay, what do we got up next? Next question. By the way, if you're getting good value so far from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you help us spread the word by hitting the like button on whatever platform you're watching. Okay, what do we got? Next question. How do we create a data center expansion demand generation response program for modernizing grids for HPC, for high performance computing, and AI, artificial intelligence? So how do we create a demand response program for data center expansion, focusing primarily on modernizing grids for high performance computing, HPC, and artificial intelligence, AI? So let's think about where we are in the data center ecosystem. There's operators, there's technology companies, there's facilities companies, there's construction and real estate companies, investors, and outsourced sales and marketing companies. So where does a company fit in that's primarily focused on modernizing grids for high performance computing and AI? Modernizing grids typically is external to the facility. So it's not a facilities related company. It's for sure not a technology company. It is more than likely something having to do with construction and real estate investment trusts, and for sure investors, huge amounts of capital. So when it comes to modernizing grids and infrastructure, and we know with the escalating and accelerating demand for all things AI, just to put this in context, we have Jensen Huang from NVIDIA predicting $1 trillion being spent on upgrading hyperscale facilities over the next 4 years. We have longtime OG of the IT industry, Michael Dell, predicting that there's going to be 100-fold increase in data center demand over the next decade. We have Project Stargate that's bringing, $500 billion of data center infrastructure investment into Texas. Is that Oracle and SoftBank and third party escaping me? Someone can drop that in the comments, but there's just massive amounts of capital going into upgrading data center infrastructure and power grids, because we know this is the real constraint. And that's why you're starting to see a lot of alternative energy providers where essentially they're building off-grid capacity, they're building microgrids. They want to be able to self-generate so they don't have utility companies, elected officials, regulators, community activists. They don't want any of that standing in their way. So they're looking at things like, I interviewed for the podcast last week, pretty recently, liquid natural gas. Basically they're building turbines, putting turbines in place so people can take liquid natural gas and power decent sized data center, multi-megawatt data center facilities using liquid natural gas. And this can be used as the primary with traditional diesel generators as the backup. It could be used as a backup supply if something else is being used as the primary, but LNG, liquid natural gas, for sure is in the conversation. Another kind of alternative energy provider that I'm seeing starting to really get a lot of momentum are fuel cells, hydrogen fuel cells. This is another renewable, sustainable source that makes people happy, that it doesn't have the carbon footprint like traditional fossil fuels. So again, hydrogen fuel cells, HFC technology, is getting a lot of attention recently as another way to create these alternative power sources for either primary or secondary source for these big facilities. And then, of course, there's working with elected officials and utility companies and regulators, and hopefully getting enough cooperation from community activists to work on modernizing the grids at a palatable cost for what the community invests versus what the data center developer invests. And I think that's a lot of the cause of debate in local areas is who's paying for all this. And then the second part of this, traditionally modernizing the grids and putting traditional grid capacity, this is where you start to see conversations like, what is it, Northern Virginia waiting 7 years right now, multi-years also in Silicon Valley for getting hooked up to the grid. So it's basically game over in those two regions, and you're going to start to see increasingly more of that, which is why there's so many conversations about not only modernizing the grids and off-grid and private grids and microgrids, but these alternative sources of fuel. Battery storage is another way to smooth out and normalize the demand from peaks to lower peak kinds of day. And for sure, there are other kinds of renewable sources like solar and power and wind that can make a tiny dent, but I think at this stage of the game, those kind of sources are primarily going to be limited to things like lighting the parking lot, perimeter lighting, maybe some interior lighting, but for sure not going to make much of a dent in these really, really high density workloads that need alternative forms of cooling just to keep the whole facility from not overheating. So when it comes to creating a demand response program for modernizing these grids, for high performance computing and AI, it's largely about understanding who your business model wants to be selling these kinds of solutions to. And I increasingly see when I talk with most folks in this area that there's usually 2 or 3 different kinds of stakeholders. The simplest approach usually is there's a direct stakeholder. These are general contractors, these are developers, these are investors, which, by the way, those are 3 buyer personas just in and of itself, but they're direct stakeholders that would potentially be able to greenlight a off-grid, private grid, some kind of related investment for around these conversations. And then there's also these third parties. It's like a channel partner. If you've worked in the technology side of the data center ecosystem for several years or a big part of your career, you're likely very familiar with the kind of channel partners that show up in data center technology stacks. So it'd be like integrators, data center focused managed service providers, consultants, and of course, operators are very, very familiar with channel partner playbooks. Telecommunications companies are very familiar with channel partner playbooks. So when it comes to creating this demand response, generating leads, educating and building trust, accelerating some of these leads into sales opportunities and new clients for both high performance computing and AI for a construction developer, facilities-ish, not really facilities internally, but the external to the facility, power generation, energy generation kind of company, I think you really have to get very specific on where you're picking your battles. Who are the companies that are most likely to be able to afford investing in your kind of solution? How big do they need to be to afford your minimums? Is there a certain point where they get so large that your company may not be able to deliver on that demand? So that's when it comes to the company size portion of your ICP, your ideal client profile. You have this band of like, okay, I don't know, maybe for microgrid, maybe they need to be at least a $50 million revenue for your local currency equivalent business. Maybe they need to have at least 500 employees. But once they get to 10,000 employees, maybe the sales process for hyperscalers is more the financial requirements, the political capital kind of requirements that you need to have are overwhelming for your company. So maybe you say, okay, I want leads, I want opportunities from companies that are anywhere from 500 to 10,000 employees. I want these companies to be located in this country or in this region of country where I know I currently have the ability to market, sell, install, service this kind of solution relative to our capabilities today. And I know there's certain verticals, certain niches, certain industries that are a better fit than others. So when you're able to document the size, the location, the industries, it helps to narrow things down quite a bit, because from there, you can go about building a target account list as a spin-off of your ideal client profile. And then once you have the target account list, you can figure out who are the 1, 2, 3 different kinds of stakeholders in these kinds of companies that are going to care most about modernizing grids for high performance computing and AI. And the most important economic stakeholder, you'll call that your primary buyer persona. The second most important kind of economic stakeholder, we'll call your secondary buyer persona. Maybe there's a tertiary buyer persona. Once we identify, that's going to drive our segmentation. Segmentation is really important for the real estate on your website homepage, like the boxes, the clickables. It's really important for having a separate page on your website for each of them. It's really important for your top and bottom navigation. It's really important for the drop-down lists that show up on your lead generation forms. It's really important for how you do the segmentation and the scoring and the qualification strategy and your CRM, your customer relationship management system. Get that segmentation right. And then within those segments, do your homework, do your research to figure out what each segment cares the most about. What are their top 5, their top 10 biggest goals that they're trying to achieve individually, as a team, as a company, when it comes to anything and everything having to do with grid supply, for grid power supply, grid energy issues that are tied to AI and HPC. And then figure out what they're struggling with the most. What are their biggest challenges? What are their biggest frustrations when it comes to grid issues related to AI and HPC? And when you do this for your primary, for your secondary, for your tertiary buyer persona, it makes it much easier for you to educate and build trust with those folks about the issues that they care most about. Not what you'd like them to care about, but what they actually care about. We need to meet them where they are. And we need to understand and have respect for the self-guided buyer's journey. What the self-guided buyer's journey means is we now live in a world where people have become increasingly allergic to spending time with salespeople. So what that means is your traditional account executives, your traditional sales development, business development kind of reps, your AEs, your SDRs, your BDRs, even your account managers, your client success to a certain degree, they need a makeover. They need to show up and look a lot more like consultants and teachers and subject matter experts and trusted advisors. Some of them may be even considered thought leaders when it comes to anything and everything with modernizing grids for AI and HPC. And there'll be different members of your team who are in a better position to pull this off than others. Maybe you need some of your external consultants and channel partners to come in and do this. But at the end of the day, our goal is to get in early and often with the right people in the right places at the right time. And most of all, in the right context. So your client-facing team members get out of the vendor box, get out of the commodity provider business as quickly as possible, and are truly getting that super important face time when it matters with the most important kind of stakeholders to earn their way in throughout the full buyer's journey, and the awareness and the consideration stages and those formative stages of those 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision, when your client-facing team members would have a significant opportunity to be the ones that are training, advising, driving alignment across multiple stakeholders from each one of these accounts about how they look at anything and everything having to do with microgrid decisions and modernizing grid decisions that are really, really important to moving ahead with their AI and HPC kind of aspirations. So that's how I would approach all of this at a high level in terms of how you actually deliver this. Once you know their goals and challenges and you've understood which is most important, you have some priority order around this, then that influences what you do with your content strategy, what you do with your educational events. You should have some great downloadable premium content. All of this should drive what you do with your website copywriting. Your website may need a makeover. You may need a significant redesign to be a lot more client focused on addressing what they care most about. So you have a way to earn your way in early and have a way to earn your way in a way that wants them to want to be motivated to spend time with your client-facing team members. So your AEs, your account executives, your sales development reps aren't spending all day begging for meetings. No, it's the other way around. Is your client-facing team members have such a strong, positive reputation in the industry as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with modernizing grid, modernizing energy infrastructure for AI and HPC, that the right people are drawn to you and want to spend lots of time with you. So downloadable content, explainer videos, great website content, and most of all, great educational events. They could be in-person events like breakfast seminars, lunch and learns, conferences, symposias, if they're able to attend, and that makes sense logistically. You may also want a virtual playbook of that, where you're doing online events, online summits, educational webinars, live streams, all of the above. And you can repurpose this for the 10 times more, 100 times more people that should have attended but weren't able to make it to the live events. All those additional stakeholders, their peers on their team and other teams within their company that are going to have a major say in deciding what that particular company does with modernizing grid infrastructure to support their HPC and AI innovations. But make no mistake, we live in a world now where so much of this is happening before people are open to having a conversation with a member of your sales team. So our way is to have such incredibly high levels of empathy that we create this fantastic professional development experience where they are highly motivated to not only want to learn from us, but they bring all their colleagues with them. They bring their boss with them. They bring basically the decision committee with them. That allows you to drive collaboration, allows you to drive alignment across multiple stakeholders from the same team and across multiple teams from the same company. Because going forward, that's a lot of what the job description for an account executive is going to look like. It's not about selling better. It's helping them buy better. It's helping them navigate the decision. It's supporting your internal champion in a way like a project manager that helps them drive alignment across multiple stakeholders in the company that see modernizing grid, modernizing their energy for HPC and AI as being tremendously strategically valuable to this company. This is a culture change for a lot of companies. And because of that, your C-level, your executive sponsor buy-in is an incredibly important part of this as well. So taking all of that into account, that's how I would approach creating a data center expansion demand response program for modernizing grids for HPC and AI, for the data center operator, for the end user data center, for the data center wholesaler, the hyperscaler, the colo provider that wants to expand to support AI and HPC, but just simply doesn't currently have grid capacity to do this. This is your way to earn your way in with the right people, in the right places, at the right time throughout the full journey, and most of all, in the right context. So the right people see your client-facing team members as the be-all, end-all experts on anything and everything having to do with modernizing grids for AI and HPC for these specific kinds of stakeholders in these specific kinds of companies in this specific geographic area of roughly this size in certain kinds of industries. And the better job you do at that, the more you have this beautiful outcome of getting everyone on the same page, both in a pre and a post-purchase scenario. And these are big enterprise deals. Don't go cheap on this. There's a very good chance that you're going to need to reallocate resources. If you have strong unit economics, and let's face it, when it comes to modernizing grids in the US, these are 9-figure projects. Maybe some of the small ones are 8-figure projects. There's a lot at stake when you can get this right. And a lot of getting this right means showing up like a media company, showing up more like teachers and consultants and subject matter experts and trusted advisors. Educational content, extremely empathetic client content that helps to educate and build trust is the way forward. That's, again, how I would approach creating that data center expansion demand response program for modernizing grids for HPC and AI. Okay, if you're getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button to help spread the word. What do we have next? What's our next question? Another one with energy and power. Well, that is for sure a big area, hot area that has been all of the buzz in the industry for the last 6, 12, 18 months as we've had this tsunami of AI-driven demand causing all kinds of grid shortages and overheating shortages. And so, okay, another question related to power, cooling, and energy. So the question is, how does a data center energy storage company connect with data center reps? How does a data center energy storage company connect with data center representatives? So this company is principally in the business of selling battery storage, energy storage for data centers that allows you to take one form of energy and store it to be used at a later date and time, typically to smooth out fluctuations and to balance out peak demand and lower load to optimize for cost and actual grid capacity. So the person who asked this question is not looking to connect with end users who would buy these energy storage, battery storage systems. They're looking to connect with data center representatives, meaning manufacturers' representatives, meaning that commission only kinds of sales companies that basically take over running their sales teams for them. So let's think about how this fits in with the bigger picture data center ecosystem. A data center energy storage company, they're not an operator. They would likely sell to operators, but in this particular case, it doesn't sound like they want to sell directly to operators. They want their reps to be selling to operators, to bring their own book of business, to bring their own relationships and basically take over that sales function. So the energy storage company, they're not an operator. They're not a technology company. They're more facilities related, power and cooling related, the first cousin of like battery backups and generators. So they're a facilities related company. They're not in the business of building data centers. They're not a construction company. They're not in the real estate business. They're not investors. They're squarely focused on the facilities part of data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. And what they've decided to do for this energy storage company, that's one of the roughly dozen or so business models that operates within data center facilities, they've decided instead of hiring their own sales team, their own account executives, their own sales development reps, and hiring their own marketing, they've decided to basically punt the whole thing down to third parties, down to manufacturers reps, independent sales reps, basically the first cousin of channel partners, and they're looking to connect with folks like that. So manufacturers reps, sales consultancies, brokers, 3 or 4 synonyms. We could split hairs and talk about some of the business model differences, but it's largely about a company in and around the data center ecosystem that instead of hiring marketing and sales and making those investments and ramp time and all the people, process, and technology to make that happen, they decide to partner with a company or more than one company to do this in a specific geographic region. This happens sometimes when you have, for example, if the energy storage company is located in Europe and has never before had a foothold in the United States, and they decide that even though in Europe they have full-time salaried employees in marketing and sales and installation and services and support that run everything, they decide maybe in Asia or in the United States to hire one or more independent manufacturers reps, essentially, to be their marketing, sales, and services presence in their local area. They may come to the conclusion that they actually need 2 different kinds of companies. They may need someone that handles the marketing and sales and another kind of company that takes care of the installation and the service, because they're very, very different skill sets. So it's usually they're approaching this either because they simply don't have the capital or the desire to build this kind of talent, to carry this kind of payroll themselves in all of their regions, or maybe in a specific geographic region. So there's that. However, the cautionary note with all of this is you definitely lose some fidelity in the cycles. You lose some of the feedback loop in the cycles when you do this. What does this mean, for example? That when you own your own marketing team, when you own your own sales team, when you own your own installers and services teams, sitting in your CRM, you get data that's incredibly valuable to your product manager to decide what's working and what's not, what to do next. When you send this down to third-party companies like manufacturers reps, independent sales consultancies, brokers, channel partners to do this on your behalf, they focus on what's most important to them. Meaning that in some cases, you'll get feedback from these third-party companies. In other cases, it's either not of interest to them, there's a conflict of interest to share this feedback, or it's not their number one priority. So because there's an intermediary involved, because there's a middle person, a middleman, whatever you want to call it, that's involved potentially between you and the client, there's this loss of these feedback cycles, which from a product management perspective is not always optimal. The flip side, though, is that you can grow and scale with a lot less capital. And in many cases, you can speed things up Quite a bit. So now that we've talked through the kind of the pros and cons and how this would work in practice for a battery storage and energy storage company that wants to connect with data center reps, I'm not quite sure why they find it so challenging to find the representatives. What's usually a lot more challenging than finding the representatives is getting representatives that say, we're interested, yeah, we'll do this. And the reason why it's so challenging to find the representatives that say, yeah, we're interested, we'll do this, is a lot of times you're approaching those representative companies really, really early on in the life cycle for that particular product in that particular region, really, really early on. And because of that, you can't really go and say, hey, you're our third rep, our fourth rep in this area, or we did this in the US, so we don't anticipate that it's going to be that different in Canada or Mexico, or we did this in Singapore, we don't anticipate that it's going to be that different in doing this in Malaysia, whatever it is. There's no pattern recognition for you to say, hey, talk to this company over here. They've been doing a really good job with this over the last 2 or 3 years. We think there's some culture differences. We think there's some pricing differences. The product needs to be modified slightly, but we think you're going to have a similar kind of, if they don't have that track record where they've had channel partner or manufacturer's rep market fit, which would be the first cousin of product market. If you think about product market fit is knowing the ideal clients, the products and services, the energy storage products and services they purchase from your company, the price points and the frequency. That's the earliest stage of a brand new startup. The next stage beyond that is go-to-market fit, where you figured out ideally who the ideal clients are, what they buy, the price points, the frequency, all your unit economics, and you figured out with go-to-market fit that you've successfully scaled beyond founder-led sales. You have multiple sales teams in place, anywhere from a couple handfuls to a few dozen, maybe several hundred salespeople, successful marketing people that are generating these demand, closing profitable, successful, happy clients. And you know that when you put another million, 10 million, 100 million, whatever it is, in capital into your business, you're going to have some reasonably predictable outcomes. So that's product market fit and go-to-market fit. When it comes to channel partner, recruiting and retaining and enabling channel partners and motivating channel partners to do something like this for your business without being full-time employees of your company, once you've done this successfully, you'll have channel partner market fit, which again, the first cousin of go-to-market fit and product market fit. And when we talk about recruiting reps, manufacturers, reps, or sales consultancies, it's pretty much the same criteria. Having manufacturers rep market fit, where we know that we've had multiple manufacturers reps who've been successful in deploying your playbook in that particular region. They've signed on at least a couple handfuls or at least a handful or two of successful clients. They've done this profitably. The rep is happy. The people that work for the rep are happy, both on the sales and services side, and the clients are super happy. And you've led to good outcomes all around. That's having manufacturers rep market fit. And early on, when you don't have that, everything is one big experiment. So this is the challenge, not in finding and connecting with data center reps. This is that early on, in the same way a super early stage startup runs a lot of experiments to get to product market fit. And then the next step is as they start to scale their sales team and marketing team, they start to run experiments to get to go-to-market fit. You're essentially running experiments to get to rep market fit, to get to manufacturers rep, sales consultancy, broker market fit, whatever you want to call this. And whether you're upfront with your reps or not, most of your reps will ask the tough questions and figure out that you're using them as guinea pigs, that you're using them as lab rats. So that's the challenge with all of this, is whether they're willing to take the risk of being the pioneers with this particular playbook for your products in a brand new market where no one has ever done this before. So it's not a matter of connecting. It's a matter of building strong enough relationships where you educate and build trust with those reps to the point where you can have a reasonable win-win conversation, as opposed to you just trying to pull the wool over their eyes and hoping that it doesn't come up that no one has ever been successful with this playbook in this region for your particular energy storage product. So let's be candid. Let's be clear about this. Let's be proactive about this and make sure that we're going into this with the right mindset. So that's how I would approach how a data center energy storage company can connect with and have productive conversations to advance the relationships with data center sales reps. So that brings us to, that was our third question for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. We have 3 more questions queued up for the second half, and we'll come back and dive into those right after this quick break.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.
Hey, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and I'm thrilled that you're joining us for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you have an idea for a topic, a challenge, or a question that you think we should address in an upcoming show, an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you are watching us with. And if you've been getting good value so far from this week's show, make sure that you hit the like button to help spread the word, share the love. So next question up that I'm going to address this week is, how does a modular data center provide budget-friendly solutions for clients? How does a modular data center provide budget-friendly solutions for clients? So apparently you've decided for your modular data center company that you want to compete on price or compete on the entry point, the lower end of the market, where they're going to spend less on modular data centers than other kinds of clients would. So with that in mind, there's a couple of vectors, there's a couple parameters to be thinking about. For starters, is there are operations and finance issues, very, very real operations and product and finance issues that come up when you decide that you want to be the low-cost provider, the budget-friendly option in a particular market. So if your COO, if your CFO, your chief operations officer, your chief finance officer, your product manager are not watching this, hit pause and go get them right now. Because your ability to execute a playbook profitably for modular data centers and positioning as budget friendly is very heavily dependent on product roadmap decisions and operations and logistics and supply chain issues and financial issues. This is a much bigger issue than just go-to-market sales and marketing. Once that's resolved and you've decided that this is truly the segment you want to go after, and you've figured out from a product standpoint, from an operations, from a finance standpoint, how you're actually going to do this, then yes, it becomes a topic for the go-to-market sell, the data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A show, where we can actually talk about the go-to-market parts of that. That would pull in stakeholders from your marketing team, your sales team, your account management team, perhaps your channel partner team, if you're working with integrators and consultancies and others who'd be interested in helping to sell or co-sell your modular data centers to operators or end user data centers. So once you've gotten buy-in and taken care of all of the super important kind of facilities, manufacturing, operational, product related issues, let's talk about go-to-market, how we would approach this. We need to know, for this budget-friendly product line of modular data centers that you're developing, that you're building, that you're manufacturing, what do we know about what these folks have in common? Are there case studies? Are there testimonials? Are there reviews from folks that have invested in your budget-friendly modular data centers who've been blown away that we can lean on? Or is this data sitting in your CRM, your customer relationship management system? We want to figure out, for these budget-friendly modular data centers, who are these companies? How big or how small are they? What's the minimum number of employees or the minimum amount of revenue that this particular company needs to have to support affording your low-cost entry point for your modular data centers? Is it a certain number of employees? Is it a certain amount of revenue? But we need to know the floor. We need to know, you know what your budget, you know what the budget-friendly option is going to cost. You know who's been happy buying these, deploying these, expanding, buying more of them. So what's the floor? Is it a company with 50 employees? Is it a company with 200 employees? Is it a company with 500 employees? Again, only you can answer that question, but we should know the floor. And on the upper end of the range for dialing in your ideal client profile, at what points, size-wise, in terms of annual revenue or number of employees, does your budget-friendly option become completely inappropriate for a large major enterprise client? Do they start to need things from a technology standpoint, from facilities, from capital, from compliance, logistics, whatever, where your budget-friendly option is just completely inappropriate for a company with 100,000 employees or 10,000 employees or 5,000 employees? And again, only you can answer that question. But from building a successful and executing a successful go-to-market, we need answers on those questions. Goldilocks. Not too big, not too small. What's the minimum size they need to be to afford your budget-friendly options? And at what point have they outgrown your budget-friendly options? In this example, let's say, for example, it's a company that has at least 50 employees and less than 5,000 employees. And depending on geographically where you're selling these modular data centers, that should give you a good list of a couple thousand, at least a couple hundred companies that are potential candidates for buying these data centers. Or maybe it's a couple dozen. It depends, again, on the geographic region where you're selling these. So where are these operators located? Where are these end users located who potentially buy your modular data centers, and how big or how small they are? And are there certain industries, are there certain niches, are there certain verticals that are better fits than others, depending on their capital structure, their needs? Maybe there's some compliance issues that come up that are unique to healthcare, financial services, government, whatever it is, that you're either in a great position to deliver on or you'd be instantly disqualified on. So let's nail down that ideal client profile for where they're located, where you can sell and deliver and install and service these modular data centers, how big or how small their companies are, and if there's certain industries that are a particularly good fit or a particularly bad fit for your budget-friendly modular data centers. So that's the ICP, the ideal client profile, part of that go-to-market playbook. Then we need to get to the people part of the playbook. Who are the stakeholders within these companies that care most about investing in one of your budget-friendly modular data centers? The most important economic stakeholder, we're going to call that person your primary buyer persona. They have the biggest economic impact. The second most important kind of stakeholder that shows up on a decision committee, we're going to call that person a secondary buyer persona. And depending on the company's size, maybe there's a third category of stakeholder that matters a lot. We'll call that person the tertiary buyer persona. There could also be a negative buyer persona that when that individual shows up, it's like the kiss of death and the deal's not going forward. So once we have an idea of who the different stakeholders are, this is going to drive our segmentation. This will drive our segmentation for our website copywriting, how we do our website pages, how we do our website navigation, how we do our calls to action, our CTAs, our lead generation, how we do nurturing, how we do the drop-down lists on our lead gen forms, how we do the segments, the filters, the lists in our CRM system, perhaps how we do pricing, how we advance the sales process, all of that, how leads are assigned. All of that is heavily dependent on really understanding these buyer personas. The most important one, primary, the second most important, secondary. And to make sure that we show up with a successful go-to-market that educates and builds trust, that generates leads from the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right contact, we have to understand. We have to be extremely client empathetic to know what's going on in their world. So when we look at the most important, that primary buyer persona, what are the biggest goals that they're trying to achieve professionally as an individual, as a team, and as a company when it comes to anything and everything having to do with modular data centers and just digital infrastructure data centers in general? We need the consensus in their own words, not what you think their words are, but what their words actually are, because we've done their homework. We've done the homework. And we need to be able to prioritize and understand which goal is the most important. Along the same lines, the other end of the equation, we need to understand what they're struggling with the most. What are their biggest challenges? What's stressing them out to no end when it comes to modular data centers, when it comes to data centers in general and digital infrastructure and critical facilities? And again, we're not going to guess on what those challenges are. We need to do the research. We need to do our homework to get the consensus on those in their own words, ideally knowing which are the biggest ones in prioritization kind of order. And once we have strong clarity on that for the primary buyer persona, we're going to repeat the exact same process for our secondary and perhaps even our tertiary buyer persona. That tells us the words, the goals, the challenges that we need to use for our website copywriting. If your website copywriting was done without this, who is this content for? If you're wondering why your website is not resonating, why your messaging isn't working. Who did you write this content for? Was it for your primary and your secondary buyer personas, using the language that they care most about with achieving their professional goals and addressing their biggest professional challenges, their biggest professional stressors? If it's not, you need to do some updates. Your lead generation offers, your ebooks, your planning guides. Is it using the language that they care most about? Your webinar program, your educational events, your email newsletter, your email nurturing. Is it using the language, the words, the goals, the challenges that they care most about? If not, it's time to go do some updates. And when it comes to your point of differentiation being budget friendly, you need a way somewhere around the middle of the journey, around the consideration stage, to start introducing content that deals with budget related issues. Maybe it's calculators, maybe it's Excel or Google spreadsheet templates, maybe it's content that's a little more focused on a CFO rather than just an IT executive. But either way, somewhere around the middle of the journey, you need to be in the education business around that topic, around budgets, around finance, on helping them to understand the pros and cons of different decisions that go into building successful modular data centers, with a focus on pros and cons and comparing different options that have to do with financial decisions, pricing decisions, cost decisions. So the better job you do at that, the more likely it is that you're going to earn your way in and stay with them early and often throughout that full journey. So instead of your account executives and sales development reps nagging the heck out of those individuals to the point where you're perceived as being a pest and an annoyance and they don't want to spend time with you, we turn this completely around. We provide such amazingly helpful educational resources and educational events that the IT executives, the CEOs, the CFOs, whoever is involved in making these decisions, they're dying to spend time with your members of your client-facing teams, because they see you as educators, as consultants, as experts, as trusted advisors when it comes to anything and everything having to do with making the right investment decisions around their modular data centers in general, digital infrastructure, and their critical facilities. And the better job you do at that, the more likely it is that when they show up to your educational events, for your webinars, lunch and learns, breakfast seminars, tours, whatever it is, that they bring their coworkers, they bring their boss, they bring other members of the team. So you're driving alignment before they even get to the stage of the decision stage of the journey. And when you do that, that not only nearly guarantees that you stay on the short list, but when you do this well, your competition starts to disappear from the short list because they're learning so much from your experts. Why would they need to be learning from anyone else? And you're in a dramatically powerful position to shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the other competitive options that are in front of them when it comes to their modular data centers. And you'll know this is working well because you finally get to a sales meeting and multiple stakeholders from this company are literally quoting your educational resources that you taught them about how they should approach the research and decision making when it comes to anything and everything having to do with modular data centers. So price sensitivity may actually start to melt away, but at the absolute minimum, for the budget friendly option, you have dominated, crushed the mind share that you need with education and trust building to have a very, very high lead to opportunity rate and a very, very high opportunity to close rate. And most of all, super happy clients that have a smooth onboarding and installation process. They love what they're getting. They add more. They buy more modular data centers for their other facilities. They scream from the rooftops about how much value they're getting from working with your company. They send all their buddies when they meet with them at their associations and their chapters and their events and everything. And they, in essence, become an extension of your sales team. So with all of that in mind, that's how I would approach building a go-to-market playbook for a modular data center company that wants to provide budget-friendly solutions to their clients. Start with figuring out from an operations, from a finance perspective, from a product perspective, how you're actually going to do this. And then bring in the go-to-market playbook, which is going to heavily focus on education and trust building for very specific kinds of companies and very specific kinds of stakeholders within those companies. How do modular data centers provide budget-friendly solutions for their clients? Okay. If you're getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button. And what do we got up next? What's our next question? How can an IT physical infrastructure company improve their demand generation? How does an IT physical infrastructure company improve demand generation? So what this largely comes down to is understanding where you can play and win best. I think a lot of companies are trying to sell to everyone. And unless you have the resources of a Fortune 1000 brand, like a publicly traded company, you can't afford to sell to everyone. And the reality is, even most huge enterprise Fortune 1000 kind of companies in this ecosystem have all segmented their go-to-market by now. They have specific marketing and sales teams and playbooks, in most cases segmented by size, like SMB, small and medium-sized business, mid-market, and enterprise. They also, in many cases, segment by vertical. You see teams that just sell into healthcare or just sell into financial services. They just sell into state and local and education or something like that. And then you also see direct marketing, direct sales teams as opposed to indirect, like channel partner organizations. And in many cases, if they have a really sophisticated channel chief and channel partner playbook going, you'll even see segmentation within there, where there's different teams that are selling, for example, to managed service providers, as opposed to integrators, as opposed to consultancies, as opposed to master agents. It depends on the nature of your business model, but there's a lot of different categories of channel partners that often merit segmentation as well when it comes to your demand generation. But at the end of the day, we can't boil the ocean. And even if we were going to boil the ocean, we could only do it if we have massive resources and it actually makes sense to do that. And more than likely, as I was just talking about a moment ago, you'd probably still segment to boil portions of that individually where you think you can win best. The smaller your company, the more you need to pick your competitive battles with much, much more precision. So I don't know context-wise how big or how small your company is. I don't know whether you're a couple handfuls or a few dozen employees or you have thousands of employees. When I have something that varies by where the context varies depending on your resources, I usually like to pick middle of the road. So let's say your company could have anywhere from a few dozen to a couple hundred employees. What would be the appropriate relevant playbook for a company in physical infrastructure with anywhere from a few dozen to a few hundred employees to improve their demand generation? So what I'd want you to do is first look at where your clients have been most successful in onboarding and retaining and continuing to use and buy even more of your company's physical infrastructure in the past. And that typically is going to show up in reviews, in testimonials, in case studies, in your logos. At the absolute minimum, it's going to show up in your CRM and your customer relationship management system. So we need to see the pattern recognition. We need to know and define this in a simple one-page ideal client profile, ICP kind of document. Where are these clients located that want your physical infrastructure, that have been happiest with them? Is it a certain geographic region? Is it a whole entire country? Is it several different countries? Is it an entire continent? Is it global? So again, you need to answer geographically where you've been most successful, where they've been happiest, where they've been most profitable, most gratifying for your company, most strategic for your company. In addition to that, in the same way there are resource constraints that come up for your company, there's also size issues that come up with physical infrastructure decisions that may make your company a great fit or make your company a lousy fit. So you know your product line for your company's physical infrastructure. How big does a company need to be to afford your entry level point? Can they afford your entry level point as a 10-person startup? Do they need to have at least 50 employees, at least 5 or 10 million in revenue or your local currency equivalent? Do they need to be more mid-market? Do they need to be at least 500 employees? Maybe they need to be 50 million, 500 million in revenue or your local currency equivalent to afford your minimum entry point. And again, only you can answer that question. But in your ideal client profile, you need to have a floor of the minimum size they need to be. So you're not spinning your wheels, wasting your marketing and sales resources, your demand generation resources on a lot of companies and individuals that are not even remotely in the ballpark for being able to be a good fit for your company. And at the upper end of the range, are there certain enterprise size companies where you're just outmatched, where the physical infrastructure requirements that they have are way beyond what you can market, sell, and service today. So that's the upper end of the range. And maybe if 500 employees is the minimum, maybe 5,000 or 10,000 employees is the maximum. And that may seem like a narrow band, and it might be, but it depends on your business model. It depends on your capabilities. It depends on your win-loss analysis, where you can do best. These are very closely tied to product strategy decisions, operational issues, financial issues, the amount of capital, your unit economics. It's all wrapped in together. But in terms of demand generation, get really specific with that ideal client profile and know where they're located and how big or how small their companies are. And also, are there certain kinds of business models, industries, or niches that are more relevant than others? When it comes to physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure, a lot of times there's compliance issues that pop up, or accreditation issues, or certification issues that are unique to specific geographic regions and or unique to specific verticals or industries within that particular geographic region. Knowing your marketplace will tell you, like, are you primed to do business in this area across all kinds of business, or just specific kinds of businesses? If it's just with specific kinds of business, that needs to be reflected in the industry targeting portion or industry exclusion portion of your ideal client profile. So nail that ideal client profile, know geographically where they're located, how big or how small they are, and are there certain industries or niches that are better fits than others. Then within those, we should be able to, from that ICP, build out a target account list of specific companies who'd be a great fit for our physical infrastructure. Depending on how big or small you define your addressable market or your ideal client profile, it could be a couple dozen, it could be a couple hundred, maybe it's even a few thousand potential companies that you want to be able to market and sell, that you want to generate demand with. And then who are the people within these companies that care the most about the kind of physical infrastructure solutions, the products and services that you offer? The most important, your primary buyer persona. The second most important is your secondary buyer persona. Maybe there's a channel partner buyer persona that matters. Maybe there's a tertiary buyer persona, the third most important. Maybe there's a negative buyer persona, where when a specific kind of stakeholder shows up, they're a detractor. They're looking to derail your sales process for their own selfish interests. So once you know all of that, taking that into account, I would also think about the self-driven buyer's journey. So 10 years ago, if you were marketing and selling IT physical infrastructure for data centers, digital infrastructure for critical facilities, you can count on the fact that most of your prospects and clients would get to about the halfway mark in their journey in your sales cycle, and they'd be ready to meet with someone from your sales team, like a sales development rep or account executive. 10 years of digital transformation, millions of baby boomers retiring, more millennials and Gen Z in decision-making roles, tens of millions of people working from home in the start of the 2020s, millions of people continuing to work from home. And that 56% number halfway through the journey is now jumped all the way to 83%. What does that mean? Gartner's latest research found that 83% of a typical research and decision-making process now happens without you being in the room. It's 83% over before you get to meet a prospect or a client. That means that even if you do everything perfectly, you're only in there for the final 17%. What that means is, if you want to be able to earn a seat on their side of the table so that you can shape how they evaluate, how they consider all of the different options that are in front of them when it comes to IT physical infrastructure, your old school playbook is not going to cut it anymore. In most cases, this means that your client-facing team members, the AEs, the account executives, the sales development reps, and similar kinds of positions, the marketers, need to show up more like teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, maybe even thought leaders when it comes to anything and everything having to do with IT physical infrastructure for this particular ideal client profile and these specific kind of buyer personas within those accounts. And the better job we do with doing that, the more we're invited in and seen as part of their learning and development, seen as part of their professional development, workforce redevelopment. The more we resist this, the more we're stuck in the vendor box. And if we get invited in at all, we're going to have to compete on price. We're going to be seen as a commodity broker. We're going to be seen as very, very heavily commoditized when it comes to our physical infrastructure. But if we're able to earn our way in, where the primary and the secondary buyer persona are highly motivated to want to spend time with members of your client-facing team because they're learning amazingly helpful insights from them about how other similar stakeholders and similar companies have navigated closing the gap on their physical infrastructure goals and dealing with their biggest physical infrastructure challenges, the more they're motivated to want to spend time with us, the more they're motivated to want to bring their coworkers, other members of the decision committee with them to these amazingly impactful educational content and events experiences. And that's the key with all of this, is so much of the data center, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities ecosystem chases these huge global and national events. And the challenge with that is when there's thousands of people attending, there's typically only a few dozen of those companies out of the thousands attending that get to be in the education business for those couple of days. You know they're in the education business because nobody paid to speak, and yet they're on stage doing all of the teaching. For the other 95, 97, 98% of people attending, you're consuming their education. When you host your own educational events, you get to decide who you want to invite. You get to decide who is worthy of teaching these great educational events to, and how you are going to provide value. So instead of being pushed into the corner of irrelevance and being forced into being an undifferentiated, commoditized provider of physical infrastructure, you get out in front and you take the lead. And you do not need large numbers of registrants and attendees for this to work incredibly well. A lot of people get screwed up in their thinking because they're used to going to these educational events. They're used to going to these big conferences, these big global conferences with thousands of people. And they feel like, well, there was only 30 people that registered for our webinar and 15 people attended. So it was a waste of time because there weren't thousands of people there. Or, our classroom in our facility seats 30 people. We got 50 people that registered and 25 attended, but we need thousands of people. No, you don't need thousands of people to attend. You need a couple handfuls or a few dozen of the right people to attend that fit your ICP, that fit your ideal client profile perfectly, that are from accounts, named accounts that are on your target account list, that are the right buyer personas. And you can see fantastic return on investment from these small educational events with relatively few people attending virtually or attending in person, especially when they start to bring other stakeholders from the same company. And the best part, you're not investing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of your local currency equivalent for each one of these. Your investment on the virtual, on the event side, is mostly the work, the promotional work that you do to get the right people registering and attending, and the work to put together some helpful educational content, slides that is so good that they walk away constantly feeling, when they learn from you, that like, wow, that was super helpful. I can't believe, what an eye-opener, what a great use of time for me to better understand what we should be thinking about when it comes to our physical infrastructure. So on the virtual side, yeah, you need to have a good email marketing program. You need to have a little bit of software to be able to run your virtual events platform. But compared to the cost of travel, hotels and flights and dining and event fees and booths and everything, like, drop in the bucket. Even for physical in-person events, if you already have a classroom, if you already have a conference room, if you have a foyer that can be repurposed like that, and you bring people in for a breakfast event or a lunch and learn, as long as you already have a good email marketing program, as long as you already have a good database, which of course you should have, right? Because we got tight about our ideal client profile and our account-based marketing list. As long as you have that already, what's your cost? Bringing in continental breakfast for 10 or 20, 30 people, bringing in a lightly catered lunch, deli sandwiches, Italian, whatever you're going to do for a couple $100, $1,000 or $2,000, compared to the cost of going to hotels, compared to the cost of flying across multiple people across the country and competing with the 50 companies that get to be in the education business because you're one of the 2,900, 950 other people that are attending that are not in the educational business for the event. It is like night and day. I do not know why more companies in the data center digital infrastructure ecosystem are not immediately taking out their ideal client profile and looking at the 10 or 20 events they did last year and saying, you know what, it's super easy for us to pick the bottom 20% that are a complete waste of time, that aren't even remotely close to our ideal client profile. Boom, we found our budget to do great educational virtual events and in-person events for our perfect ideal client profile, for our companies on our account list, for our perfect decision makers. I don't know why this isn't happening. It's like night and day. Maybe there's more CFOs that need to talk about. Maybe there's more investors, maybe there's more board members to realize that you don't need tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands to build successful pipeline. You can be doing these things for hundreds instead of hundreds of thousands. And the cool part with doing that, not only is you have a much more intimate experience with learning from those prospects, you can make mistakes once in a while and it doesn't clobber your budget. Because would you make a mistake on an event with a $500 budget? Sure as heck rather make that mistake than an event with a $50,000 or a $500,000 budget, right? So that's at a high level how I would approach how a IT physical infrastructure company can improve its demand generation, is get really tight about who these ideal clients are, make a list of your couple dozen, your couple hundred, your couple thousand companies that matter most, really understand in those accounts who the primary and the secondary people are that you need to educate and build trust. And then invest in building a great events program, virtual and in-person events, where you're on an ongoing basis educating and building trust with multiple stakeholders from each of these target accounts. And the better job you do at that, the more they want to spend time with you, the more they see you as a trusted advisor, the more they see you as a subject matter expert, the more they see you as a thought leader. Beautiful things will happen in your funnel, in your demand generation, on your deals board, with improving the positioning, the perceived value of your company. So that's how I would approach how an IT physical infrastructure company can improve its demand generation. And that brings us to our final question for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've gotten good value from this week's show, make sure that you hit the like button. And if you have an idea for a topic, a challenge, a question that you would like to see addressed in an upcoming show, make sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching. What's our final question for this week? Drum roll, please. Okay. Another budget question and another different kind of data center provider. So the question is, how can an edge data center, how to address edge data center budget challenges? How does an edge data center provider address budget challenges? That is a fantastic question. So let's just frame where we are with it as an edge data center provider. As an edge data center provider, you are largely in the operator part of digital infrastructure, meaning your first cousins of being an edge data center provider are colo providers. At the extreme opposite end of being an edge provider are hyperscale providers. Then there's also wholesale data center providers and modular data center providers. And a modular data center provider actually could be in the edge business. In other words, like people are taking a modular data center and putting that in a very, very precise location where they're minimizing latency and dealing with a very unique physical location demand. So you're an operator, you're dealing with technologists in most cases, as opposed to facilities folks. You'll likely have your own facilities folks, but you're selling mostly to technologists, other operators, maybe some end users of data centers. You won't have much interaction with construction so much, or real estate. Yeah, the real estate matters, but likely the calculus that you use, the decision-making process that you use for investing in real estate related to edge is usually very, very different than the kind of process that you would go through for deciding where to place a hyperscale facility or even co-location facilities or wholesale kind of facilities, usually because you're dealing with a much, much smaller footprint, a lot less square footage, a lot fewer square meters, a lot less power. And you're optimizing around location, you're optimizing around minimizing latency. So for sure, there's a little bit of real estate undertones to it. There's a little bit of investment part of it, but you're primarily, as an edge provider, you're primarily a data center operator selling to technologists. So with all of that in mind, if you're optimizing around budget, you need to make sure that you're operating as efficiently as possible. So your CFO, your CTO, your product person that makes these roadmap kind of decisions needs to be really, really tightly woven into these kind of conversations, way beyond just go to market, way beyond just sales and marketing. There's an interesting dynamic going on too with edge data centers. And in many ways, as AI, artificial intelligence, and GPUs and high performance computing and supercomputing keeps pushing the envelope on workload densities that go in co-location facilities. There's these legacy co-location facilities that may only be 2, 3, 4 years old that are now becoming, to a certain degree, obsolete. To a certain degree, why am I bringing this up in the context of edge data centers? Because if these relatively new co-location facilities that are under 5 years old can't be repurposed for anything else at the absolute minimum, in many cases, they may be able to carry a premium with repositioning themselves to be focused on their extreme proximity, their extreme location to certain unique kinds of clients that are an advantage where they won't have that competing edge to edge, head to head with just traditional high density workloads that need like liquid cooling and stuff like that. That said, a lot of AI applications, a lot of smart cities, a lot of EV value edge as well, because the latency for sure becomes an issue. With edge, there's also certain kinds of clients that need an edge location for governance reasons, for local reasons, for legal kinds of reasons, but usually edge is mostly an application that has to do with extreme proximity. So it's not like a client goes and looks at the website for a large data center provider, kind of company. It's not like they're looking at a large provider in a given market and say, oh, okay, yeah, that particular provider, I don't know, whether it's Digital Realty or Equinix or whatever, like they have 5 facilities in this market, 8 facilities in this market, whatever, throw a dart at which one, we don't care, whichever has the most space and the best value. No, they can't just take one of the 5 random locations in this region and be happy. No, they need a very specific location that's on this particular corner in this particular metropolitan area, because there's a client that's across the street that needs this ridiculous amount of proximity. So, you're making decisions based on milliseconds, right? You're making decisions based on trace routes and pings and things like that. So budget challenges is an interesting monkey wrench that gets thrown in this as well, because typically with edge, most of the time, the reason a client, whether it's an end user, client, or operator, is willing to pay a premium is because they really value the extreme proximity, the extreme location part, as opposed to it just being in a particular metro area within a few miles or something like that, or being drivable. So you want to be able to address budget challenges. So presumably you want to be a budget leader. If you want to be a budget leader, one of the most important stakeholders on your decision committees is almost certainly going to be a CEO or CFO or a board member. And each of those folks may have a slightly different way of how they get involved in budget decisions. But let's also put this in context. If you're selling to enterprise, and this is a single edge location, and this is a very, very, very small part of their global digital infrastructure bill, you need to understand who your ideal clients are and how big or how small they are to know who the appropriate level of decision stakeholder is that's involved with this whole thing. So again, going back to the drawing board, where have you been most successful? What does your ideal client profile look like for your edge data center of where you can win best? When you look at the pattern recognition of the happiest, most profitable clients that are the most strategic for your business, what do they have in common? Where are they located? We know where you're located, but where are they located? Do they tend to be hyper local, or do they tend to be located anywhere and everywhere? Usually with an edge provider, they tend to be anywhere and everywhere, and they're picking your edge location because they don't currently have proximity in that area. The how big or how small is really interesting as well, because edge can be relatively inexpensive relative to other options. And because of that, your minimums may be relatively low, but at what point is low too low? In other words, can a startup, a pre-revenue startup with just a founder, afford your minimum level of entry for your edge data center location? Or do they need to be at least 10 employees, at least $1 million in revenue, or your local currency equivalent? Do they need to be at least 50 employees, at least 5 or 10 million, or your local currency equivalent? Again, only you can set that floor based on what your minimums are. And at what point does an enterprise company overwhelm your ability to deliver what they actually would want in terms of their IT requirements, their compliance requirements, their legal requirements, financial requirements, whatever it is. Do you max out? Do you tap out? Do you use your chance of winning that deal and retaining that client, drop off a cliff at 1,000-person company, at a 10,000-person company, at a 100,000-person company? Again, only you can answer that question. But when it comes to addressing budget challenges and putting together a go-to-market, I want you to know not only where they're located, but how big or how small they are, because that's going to drive what you do with your whole go-to-market playbook, what you do with understanding the personas, understanding the segmentation strategy, understanding their goals and challenges within those accounts, and being able to proactively address the budget challenges that come with anything and everything having to do with edge. Because the kinds of questions that a CFO of a Fortune 500 company would ask of an edge data center provider that's providing, 50 or 100 edge locations globally are going to be very, very, very different than what the CEO or CFO or VP of finance of a local $10 million manufacturing company would ask of your data center, and who'd be seated at the table, both who the stakeholders are and what they care most about. So we got to dial in where they're located, how big or how small their companies are. And maybe there's certain industries where you're a better fit than others. For an edge data center, there may be certain kinds of compliance issues, accreditation issues, certification issues that you either have or don't have that are unique to that particular geographic region and specific kinds of industries, whether it's financial services, healthcare, government, whatever. So know where you can win in marketing and sales and in retention, and know when you can expand and retain that client successfully. Those are all super important. So when it comes to addressing these budget challenges for an edge data center, get really, really clear on who that ideal client is, where they're located, how big or small they are, what industries they may be from. And then that's going to drive not only building out your target account list, but it'll drive who the most important stakeholders are in those accounts, your prioritization of what you're going to do with outbound prospecting, with ads, your segmentation strategy, what the drop downs look like on your forms, what your filters and lists look like in your CRM, how you go about packaging, pricing, promoting, all of that stuff. Once you get a lot more clarity at the account level and at the individual level, a lot of these decisions become much, much easier. So that's how I would take it. That's how I would take into account how to address edge data center budget challenges. So that brings us to the end of this week's Data Center Sales and Marketing Q&A show. I'm so glad that you were able to join us for this week. If you've gotten great value from the show, make sure you hit the like button. If you have an idea for a topic, a challenge, or a question that you think should be addressed in an upcoming show, be sure to drop that in the comments where you're watching. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, make sure that you're subscribed to our Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox on Sundays. You can sign up. You can subscribe directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI. If we're not currently connected on LinkedIn, feel free to send me a connect request, and for sure, make sure you include in the message that you were watching the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. So again, so glad that you're able to join us for this week. We look forward to seeing you back next week, and we look forward to hearing your great success stories or the wonderful things that you and your company are doing within data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Take care now.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.